Hello, we are going to be talking about the civil rights movement today, and we are in the same textbook. This is Prentice Hall, United States History, Modern America. This is available at the National Emergency Archives of the National Emergency Library. So, without further ado, let's get started. Early demands for equality. Why it matters. The post war period brought prosperity to many, but most African Americans were still treated as second class citizens. The civil rights movement, a broad and diverse effort to attain racial equality, compelled the nation to live up to its ideal that all men are created equal. The movement also demonstrated that ordinary men and women could perform extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice to achieve social justice, a lesson that continues to inspire people around the world today. Focus question. As we're going through this chapter, how did African Americans challenge segregation after World War II? Segregation divides America. African Americans had a long history of fighting for their rights. After World War II, the struggle intensified as African Americans grew increasingly dissatisfied with their second class status. Jim Crow laws limit African Americans. In the South, Jim Crow laws enforce strict separation of the races. Segregation that is imposed by law is known as de jure segregation. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court had ruled that such segregation was constitutional as long as the facilities for blacks and whites were separate but equal. But this was seldom the case. The facilities for African Americans were rarely, if ever, equal. In the South and elsewhere, segregation extended to most areas of public life. Officials enforced segregation of schools, hospitals, transportation, restaurants, cemeteries, and beaches. One city even forbade blacks and whites from playing checkers together. Segregation prevails around the nation. In the North, too, African Americans faced segregation and discrimination. Even where there were no explicit laws, de facto segregation, or segregation by unwritten custom or tradition, was a fact of life. African Americans in the North were denied housing in many neighborhoods. They faced discrimination in employment and often could get only low paying jobs. Jim Crow laws and more subtle forms of discrimination had a widespread and severe impact on African Americans. Black Americans occupied the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. Compared to white Americans, they had significantly higher rates of poverty and illiteracy, as well as lower rates of home ownership and life expectancy. Although African Americans living in the North could vote, most who lived in the South could not. Very few African Americans held political office. In the West and the Southwest, Asian Americans and Mexican Americans, too, faced de facto segregation and, in some cases, legal restrictions. Their struggle for equality will be discussed as part of this and later. The civil rights movement grows. In many ways, World War II set the stage for the rise of the modern civil rights movement. President Roosevelt banned discrimination in defense industries in 1941. Gunnar Myrdal's publication in 1944 of An American Dilemma brought the issue of American prejudice to the forefront of the public consciousness. Lastly, after risking their lives defending freedom abroad, African Americans were unwilling to accept discrimination at home. In the 1940s, new efforts arose to try to bring an end to racial injustice. James Farmer and several others founded the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Its members were deeply influenced by Henry David Thoreau and Mohandas Gandhi. They became convinced that African Americans could apply direct, nonviolent methods to gain civil rights. CORE organized protests against segregation in Chicago, Detroit, Denver, and other northern cities. Success was limited, but one highly visible break in the wall of segregation did take place in 1947. Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers, becoming the first African American to play Major League Baseball. Robinson braved death threats and rough treatment, but throughout his career he won the hearts of millions and paved the way for the integration of other sports. Nevertheless, African Americans continued to face discrimination and felt that racial equality was long overdue. However, the vast majority of white Americans took the opposite view. Racial violence erupted in the South, sometimes against veterans who were just trying to register to vote. In the wake of this violence, President Truman appointed a committee on civil rights to investigate race relations. In its report, the committee recommended a number of measures to ensure equal opportunity for all Americans, including an anti lynching law and federal protection of voting rights. Unfortunately, Truman was unable to win congressional support for these initiatives. However, in 1948, he did use his executive power to order the desegregation of the military. Over time, the U.S. Armed Forces would become one of the most integrated institutions in the United States. Checkpoint. How did segregation affect the lives of African Americans? Well, it prevented them from living in the places where they wanted to live. It kept them from making as much money as their white counterparts. In some cases, it even went so far as to take away their rights, specifically their right to vote. So that wraps up the first part of this topic, and we will come back to more of it in the next video. Until then, stay safe.